Help me! Cassian's desperate cry was swallowed by the deafening roar of the river. A beast that seemed to swell with every passing second, his small arms flailed against the freezing water, grasping for anything that could save him. But the river was merciless, a giant that dragged him farther and farther from the shore, from his family. The afternoon had started with laughter, with the warmth of a family picnic under the golden summer sun. Cassian, restless as always, had darted toward the water, his wooden stick transforming into an imaginary sword in his hands. "Be careful, sweetheart," his mother had called from a distance, her voice laced with affection and mild concern. But children rarely listen, especially when their minds are lost in worlds where danger does not exist. A single misstep, a moment of carelessness, and everything changed. His foot slipped on a moss-covered rock, and before he could react, he was falling. The splash silenced his laughter in an instant. The cold hit him like iron shackles, stealing the breath from his lungs. The current pulled at him with unrelenting force, and though he fought to swim toward the shore, every stroke felt useless. "Mom! Dad!" he screamed, his voice barely a whisper against the river's relentless fury. The water spun him, tossed him, its hidden rocks bruising his small body. His hands, just moments ago gripping his wooden sword, were now raw from clawing against the current. The pain in his chest tightened as fear gave way to sheer panic. He reached for a root protruding from the riverbank, but it was too far. "I don't want to die. I don't want to die," he thought as his legs began to lose their strength. His soaked clothes weighed him down, pulling him deeper as if the river itself was toying with his desperation. Time stretched, seconds becoming eternity. Above him, the sky remained a serene, endless blue, indifferent to his struggle. A wave crashed over him, and water filled his mouth. He coughed, sputtered, but the burning in his throat was unbearable. His tiny fingers kept searching, grasping, but found nothing but the violent, icy void. For a moment his head slipped beneath the surface. The world went silent. No screams, no roaring current. Just an eerie stillness, as if the river was preparing to claim him. Eyes the color of the sky locked onto the chaotic churn of the water, where a small body fought to stay afloat. The current spun him, dragged him under, and each time his head broke through the surface, his cries were barely audible over the thunderous rush of the river. The horse, dark-coated and powerful, stood motionless at the water's edge. It was a wild creature, unbridled, ruled only by instinct. Its ears twitched, sensing every sound of the unfolding tragedy. Its first instinct was to retreat. The river was not its domain, and the danger was immense. And yet, something made it pause. The child's desperate gaze met the horse's, and in that instant, something ignited between them. A spark of understanding. The warning neighs it had let out moments before no longer mattered. Fear was no longer the strongest force in its chest. Something greater had taken hold, the duty to act. The horse stomped at the damp earth, restless, as if locked in battle with itself. Its muscles trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of the decision. A step forward, then hesitation, another step back, then a sharp, decisive whinny. Without hesitation, the horse lunged into the water. The icy river hit like a sledgehammer, its frigid grasp threatening to steal the breath from his lungs. The current seized him instantly, determined to drag him downstream, but Nyx planted his hooves firmly against the rocky riverbed, muscles coiling with tension as he fought to stay upright. Each step forward was a battle, his hooves slipping on the slick stones, waves crashing against his chest as if trying to break him. But his gaze never wavered. His focus remained locked on the boy. Cassian could no longer scream. His strength had drained away. His arms floated lifelessly, and his heavy eyelids barely registered the dark figure approaching. A horse. In his foggy, exhausted mind, the sight barely made sense. Was it real? A dream? A miracle? He had no strength left to wonder. Nyx reached the child just as the current threatened to pull him into a deeper, swirling vortex. Lowering his head, the horse moved swiftly but gently, offering his neck as an anchor. With the last flicker of his will, Cassian stretched out a trembling hand and grasped the wet mane. His grip was weak, barely there, but enough for Nyx to feel it. With his purpose now set, the horse turned, bracing himself for the harder battle ahead. Moving against the current was even more grueling than pressing forward, each step a test of endurance. His hooves dug into the riverbed, scraping for purchase against the unsteady ground, while the relentless force of the water threatened to tear him away. The weight of the boy was slight, yet the river made it feel like an impossible burden. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nyx broke free from the river's grip. Water streamed from his coat, and the cold gnawed at his body. But he did not stop until his hooves touched solid ground. With a final effort, he shook his head, releasing Cassian onto the muddy bank with careful precision. The boy lay motionless, eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in a shallow rhythm, fighting for air. He coughed violently, forcing out the water he had swallowed, his body racked with shivers from exhaustion and cold. For a moment, silence reigned. Only the murmuring river and the labored breaths of the two survivors filled the air. Nyx stood still, watching the boy intently. Lowering his head, he sniffed the child's face as if needing reassurance that he was still alive. Slowly, Cassian's eyelids fluttered open, meeting the horse's deep, unwavering gaze. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath before his head fell to the side, surrendering to exhaustion. The first timid rays of sunlight filtered through the treetops, casting streaks of light over the damp earth. Cassian stirred with a faint groan, his body still trembling, every limb heavy as if weighed down by stone. For several seconds, he felt lost, unmoored. Only the cold, the thick humidity in the air, and the distant murmur of the river reached him. Then he saw him. Nyx stood there, motionless but watchful. His dark coat still dripped water, and his large, steady eyes observed him with a quiet intensity. Cassian tried to push himself up, but dizziness sent him sprawling back onto his hands. Where are they?" he murmured, a lump forming in his throat. His gaze swept his surroundings, searching, but the place where his family had been was nowhere in sight. The realization struck like a blow. He was alone. A quiet, creeping fear began to coil around his chest. But then, Nyx. The horse had not left. Lowering his head, the animal nudged the boy's shoulder with his muzzle, a silent encouragement to rise. The warmth of the touch broke through Cassian's fear, grounding him for just a moment. "Why didn't you leave?" he whispered, more to himself than to the horse. Nyx only watched him, unmoving, a steady presence in the midst of the unknown. Cassian didn't entirely understand, but he knew one thing for sure. The animal wasn't planning to leave him alone. With great effort, the boy managed to push himself up. His legs trembled, and the muddy ground felt slick beneath his soaked shoes. He took a few unsteady steps, and Nyx followed closely, its hooves sinking deep into the wet earth. All right, let's go," Cassian muttered, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to gather his thoughts. He had no idea where to go, but staying there wasn't an option. Ahead of them, the forest loomed, dark, vast, and full of secrets. Towering trees stood like ancient guardians, their thick canopies allowing only the faintest slivers of daylight to filter through. Every step Cassian took seemed unnaturally loud, as though the silence of the wilderness magnified each movement. Dry leaves crunched beneath his feet, and the distant cry of a bird was the only sign of life around them. He moved cautiously, focusing on each breath to steady himself. Despite the fear curling in his chest, the presence of Nyx beside him brought an odd sense of reassurance. With every step forward, the horse remained at his side, close enough for Cassian to feel its warmth. A thought took root in his mind, the thought of survival. He remembered his grandfather's stories about the countryside, about how to find shelter and recognize the sounds of the wild. He wasn't sure how long he could hold on, but at least now he wasn't entirely alone. As they pressed on, the sun dipped behind a thick bank of clouds, and a sharp breeze wove through the trees. Cassian hugged his arms around himself, trying to fight off the creeping cold. His eyes darted around, searching for anything useful. A place to rest, a familiar sign, something that would lead him back to his family. Then a loud grumble broke the quiet, and Cassian realized it was his own stomach. He clutched his arms around his middle, as if that could somehow silence the gnawing emptiness inside him. It was a deep hunger, the kind that drained his strength with every step. His gaze flicked toward Nyx, who walked beside him, steady and unbothered, as though hunger was a foreign thing to him. "How do you do it, huh?" Cassian muttered in frustration, even though he knew the horse couldn't answer. He tried to focus, remembering something his grandfather had once told him. The forest always had something to offer for those who knew where to look. His eyes landed on a bush, its branches heavy with small, bright red berries. He froze, staring at them. Could they be safe? His stomach ached at the mere thought of their sweetness. But then his mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Never eat anything you don't recognize, Cassian. It could be poisonous." The memory stung, and his eyes burned with unshed tears. As if sensing his hesitation, Nyx stepped closer, sniffed the bush, then nudged Cassian gently with his muzzle, urging him forward. Cassian let out a weary sigh, both frustrated and relieved that he hadn't acted on impulse. They trudged on for a few more minutes before the distant sound of running water reached his ears. A jolt of energy shot through him, and he quickened his pace. Within moments they arrived at a small, clear stream. Nyx wasted no time. He lowered his head and drank deeply. Cassian dropped to his knees by the water's edge, dipping his hands in and relishing the cool sensation against his skin. He drank in greedy gulps, letting the liquid soothe the dryness in his throat. For a brief moment, the relief overshadowed the hunger gnawing at his insides. "At least this won't kill me," he murmured, watching the water ripple past him. But the need for food still clawed at his stomach, urgent, relentless. His eyes flicked to the stream, and there, beneath the surface, tiny fish darted between the rocks. A flicker of hope ignited inside him. "I can do this," Cassian muttered under his breath, more to convince himself than anything else. He slipped off his sneakers, rolled up his jeans, and stepped into the water. A sharp chill shot up his legs, but he didn't let it stop him. Leaning forward, he plunged his hands into the water, trying to catch a fish. His movements were clumsy, his fingers barely skimming the surface before the fish darted away, sending tiny splashes in all directions, drenching him even more. "Hold still, Cassian!" he scolded himself through clenched teeth. But no matter how hard he tried, every attempt ended in failure. After several exhausting minutes, he gave up. Letting himself fall onto the riverbank, he kept his feet submerged, while his arms hung loosely at his sides. His head tilted back, eyes staring up at the grey sky that stretched endlessly above him. "I'm no good at this," he whispered, his voice cracking. Nix, who had been grazing nearby, lifted his head and slowly approached. Lowering his muzzle, the horse brushed against Cassian's cheek, pulling him out of his downward spiral. Cassian turned to look at him, finding quiet reassurance in those large, steady eyes. "You're not going to let me give up, are you?" he sighed. Nix let out a soft whinny, as if he understood. Cassian straightened up, resting his elbows on his knees. He might not have caught anything, but Nix's patience and unwavering presence gave him a strength he hadn't realized was there. "All right," he said, standing again. "We'll keep going." Night fell over the forest like a heavy cloak, wrapping everything in thick shadows and uneasy silence. Cassian and Nix moved forward slowly, the boy keeping his eyes locked on the path ahead, while the horse stayed alert, his ears flicking in every direction. With every step, the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet seemed louder, almost as if the woods themselves were trying to warn them. The air turned colder, sharper, sending a shiver down Cassian's spine. He could barely make out the towering trees around him, their dark silhouettes looming like giants. And then he heard it. A low, guttural growl rippled through the trees, so close that he froze in place. His eyes went wide, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Nix stiffened too, standing like a statue, but his ears twitched sharply toward the sound. Another growl followed, clearer this time, laced with a menace that made Cassian's stomach tighten. Slowly, he turned his head, searching for the source of the noise, and then he saw them. A pair of yellow eyes gleamed from the underbrush, then another, and another. Wolves. The realization crashed over him like ice-cold water, terror flooding his veins. The first wolf stepped out of the shadows, its dark grey fur blending almost seamlessly with the night. Its lips curled back, revealing sharp teeth in a silent, unmistakable threat. Behind it, two more emerged, their movements careful, calculated, predators through and through. Nix let out a piercing whinny, shattering the stillness. He stomped the ground forcefully, a clear warning. The wolves hesitated, their eyes locked on the horse, assessing. Cassian took a step back, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. One of the wolves edged closer, its growl rising in pitch. Without hesitation, Nix stepped forward, rearing onto his hind legs and unleashing a second, even louder whinny. So fierce, it seemed to shake the very trees around them. The wolf faltered, but did not retreat. "Do something, Cassian," the boy thought, panic gripping him. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let the wolves close in. His eyes darted frantically around until they landed on a fallen branch just a few steps away. With trembling hands, Cassian picked it up. It was thick and heavy, but he had no other choice. Holding it up in front of him, he stood close to Nix, trying to mirror the horse's courage. "Stay back!" he shouted, though his voice shook more than he would have liked. One of the wolves, likely the leader, let out a short howl and stepped forward. Nix reacted instantly, pivoting on his hind legs and lashing out with a powerful kick. The sharp sound was enough to make the wolf halt, its yellow eyes now locked onto the horse. Seizing the moment, Cassian swung the branch forcefully, his shouts, though frail, carrying an undeniable resolve. Another wolf attempted to creep closer from the side, but Nix noticed. With a swift motion, the horse turned toward it, lowering his head in a display of raw strength. The wolves shifted uneasily, reassessing their chances. Though there were three of them, Nix's size and unwavering stance made them reconsider their approach. Cassian, still holding the branch high, breathed heavily but refused to stop moving, determined to appear larger and stronger than he truly was. The pack leader let out a deeper, more commanding growl, different from before. It was an order. The other two wolves hesitated, then took a step back, and another. The leader watched them for a moment longer before turning away and vanishing into the shadows, the others following closely behind. Cassian didn't move. His body remained frozen in place, the branch still raised as he stared into the darkness where the wolves had disappeared. Several seconds passed before he finally let his arms drop, the branch slipping from his fingers onto the ground. Nyx stepped toward him, nudging him gently with his muzzle. A trembling sigh escaped the boy's lips as he sank to his knees, feeling the adrenaline slowly ebb away. "Thank you, Nyx," he whispered, barely audible. The horse let out a soft whinny as if acknowledging his gratitude. Cassian lifted a hand and ran it over his companion's strong, warm neck, drawing comfort from the steady presence beside him. Taking a deep breath, he tried to still the lingering tremors running through his body. The memory of the wolves was still vivid in his mind, but each time he looked at Nyx, a bit of that fear loosened its grip. The horse stood there, steadfast and calm, a silent guardian that would not abandon him. With effort, Cassian rose to his feet, his legs unsteady, and stroked Nyx's neck once more. "Let's go," he murmured, though he had no idea where they were heading. The only thing he knew for certain was that staying here was not an option. They moved forward slowly, the forest closing in around them. The thick canopy above barely allowed the moonlight to filter through, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Cassian stepped carefully, wary of the gnarled roots jutting out along the path, while Nyx walked with steady confidence. Then, suddenly, the trees parted. Before them, a narrow trail wound along the edge of a sheer cliff. Cassian stopped in his tracks. The abyss yawned below, so deep that the bottom disappeared into darkness. Only the distant sound of wind rising from the depths broke the heavy silence. He swallowed hard, his eyes locked onto the perilous path. His heart pounded, and a cold sweat formed on his brow. "I can't," he thought, taking a step back. Fear rooted him to the spot. Facing wolves or braving barbed wire was one thing, but this felt impossible. Nyx, however, did not share his hesitation. The horse stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned his head and looked at Cassian as if telling him to trust him. He let out a soft neigh, a sound that somehow managed to break through the boy's mental block. Cassian took a deep breath. "If you can do it, so can I," he murmured, though his legs still trembled. He took a step forward, then another, keeping his eyes fixed on Nyx's back, forcing himself not to look at the drop-off to his right. The path was treacherous. Some stones loosened under Nyx's hooves, and each small sound sent a shiver through Cassian's body. He tried to focus on moving forward, one step at a time, but the icy wind rising from the ravine did him no favors. Every gust felt like invisible hands shoving him toward the abyss. Then suddenly, one of the rocks beneath his feet gave way. A strangled cry escaped his throat as he lost his balance, his arms flailing wildly, reaching for anything to hold onto. His body tilted toward the void, and for one endless second, he thought he was going to fall. But then, something solid pressed against his back. It was Nyx. The horse had turned swiftly, positioning himself between Cassian and the cliff's edge. His strong body pushed against the boy, steadying him, keeping him from slipping further. With trembling hands, Cassian clung to a nearby rock and sucked in a deep breath, trying to calm the panic clawing at his chest. "Thank you, Nyx," he managed to whisper between gasps. The horse looked at him steadily, his breathing heavy but composed. He neighed again as if urging Cassian to keep going. The boy, still shaken, nodded weakly and forced himself to stand. This time, he kept one hand pressed against the horse's side as they moved forward, trusting in his companion's steady presence. The final stretch of the path was the hardest. The narrowest part barely had room for Cassian's feet, and each step demanded his full concentration. But Nyx walked ahead, his movements slow and deliberate, guiding Cassian with quiet confidence. He never hurried, and his calmness helped the boy push through the fear still lingering in his chest. At last, after what felt like hours, the path widened. Relief flooded Cassian when he finally stepped onto solid ground, far from the edge. His legs gave out, and he dropped to his knees, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to catch his breath. Nyx remained beside him, watching him in silence. Cassian lifted his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like days, a smile formed on his lips. "We did it," he said, a mix of disbelief and pride in his voice. "We really did it, Nyx." The horse let out a soft neigh, lowering his head toward him. Cassian reached up, running his hand over Nyx's muzzle, feeling the warmth of the animal beneath his palm. And for the first time, he realized something important. Fear never truly disappeared. But real courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about moving forward, even when every part of you wanted to turn back. Cassian stepped carefully, his fingers brushing against Nyx's back as they continued. The forest around them felt denser now, the shadows stretching deeper, the air thick with an eerie stillness. Only the crunch of leaves beneath their feet broke the silence. Something had shifted. The boy glanced up at Nyx, who walked with his ears pricked forward, his neck arched slightly. He sensed it, too. There was something nearby, something that didn't belong to the forest. Then a sharp sound snapped through the air behind them. A brief crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. Cassian froze. His heart pounded violently as he slowly turned his head. Just a few yards away, partially hidden among the trees, stood a figure. It was a man. He wore a worn-out coat and leather boots that looked like they'd traveled countless miles. In one hand, he held a rifle, and his small, sharp eyes were fixed on the sky. "Well, well," the man said in a rough voice, a smile curling on his lips, one that held no warmth. "That horse doesn't look like any ordinary one. Must be worth a fortune." A cold shiver ran down Cassian's spine. The man wasn't here by chance, and his words only confirmed Cassian's worst fears. He swallowed hard, but didn't step back. "It's not yours," Cassian said firmly, though his voice quivered slightly. The man let out a short, harsh laugh, more like a grunt. "Kid, wild animals don't have owners. This horse is better off with me. Now, step aside." Instinctively, Cassian moved, positioning himself between Nyx and the stranger. Despite the fear clawing at his chest, he wasn't about to let this man take his friend. "No," he said, clenching his fists. "He's not going with you." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. He stepped closer, raising the rifle slightly. "Listen, boy, I don't have time for your games. Move, or things will get ugly." Nyx, who had stood still until now, suddenly let out a powerful neigh, the sound cutting through the forest like thunder. He lifted his head and stomped the ground, sending a flurry of leaves and dust into the air. The man took a step back, startled by the horse's reaction. "Easy there, buddy," the man muttered, though irritation laced his voice. Cassian seized the moment, reaching down and grabbing a thick branch from the ground. It wasn't a real weapon, but it was all he had. He gripped it tightly with both hands, holding it in front of him like a shield. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice filled with a courage he didn't know he had. The man stared at him in disbelief, then let out a low chuckle, a mixture of mockery and anger. "You really think that's gonna scare me, kid?" he sneered. "This horse is mine." But before he could take another step, Nix moved. The horse reared onto his hind legs, his powerful front hooves slicing through the air. He neighed again, the sound echoing through the trees like a battle cry. The man instinctively stumbled backward, his foot catching on an exposed root. "Damn animal!" he cursed, lifting the rifle as if to aim, but he never got the chance. Nix spun swiftly and delivered a precise, forceful kick to the ground right in front of the man. Rocks and leaves exploded into the air, and whatever fight remained in the stranger drained from his face. All right, the man yelled, raising a hand in surrender as he staggered back. "Not worth the trouble." Cassian, still gripping the branch tightly, watched as the man retreated, his steps clumsy and hurried. Within seconds, he disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only the fading echo of his curses. The boy let the branch slip from his fingers, his hands trembling as he tried to steady his breathing. He turned to Nix, who remained tall and alert, his ears flicking slightly as if making sure the danger had truly passed. "You did it, buddy," Cassian whispered. "You saved us." The horse turned to him, lowering his head until his muzzle gently brushed against the boy's shoulder. Cassian lifted a hand, running his fingers along Nix's strong, warm neck, feeling the steady, reassuring pulse beneath his skin. "I promise, I won't let anyone hurt you," he said with determination, his words carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. Nix let out a soft neigh, as if acknowledging the vow. Cassian managed a weak smile, though the fear still echoed in his chest. Yet, something else had taken root in that moment, a bond deeper than before. They were no longer just a boy and a horse facing the wilderness together. They were partners, allies, a small yet formidable unit. Cassian moved forward with quick strides, his heart pounding with an emotion he hadn't felt in days: hope. In the distance, beyond the tangled branches, something caught his eye and sent a surge of renewed energy through him. A thin, steady column of grey smoke rose toward the sky, a sign that someone had lit a fire. "Could it be?" he murmured, glancing at Nix, who had also lifted his head in the same direction. The horse, of course, gave no reply, but there was a shift in his stance, as if he, too, understood that something significant lay ahead. Without hesitation, Cassian started walking, then running, with Nix close behind. Every step was a storm of emotions, anticipation, joy, and a quiet fear that his hope might crumble into nothing. He pushed through branches and undergrowth, ignoring the scratches that gathered on his arms and legs. None of it mattered. What mattered was reaching the source of that smoke, the chance that his family was waiting for him. The scent of burning wood grew stronger, solidifying the reality that this was no illusion. Cassian paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The warm air filled his lungs, and for a fleeting second he let himself dream of embraces, of soothing words, of his mother's voice calling his name. "Come on, Nix," he said, his voice unsteady as he covered the last few steps. Then, suddenly, the trees parted, as if the forest itself had decided to unveil what lay beyond. There, beside a gently crackling fire, he saw a familiar figure. His mother. She stood with her back to him, bent over a pot hanging above the flames, while two other familiar faces, his father and younger brother, moved nearby. "Mom!" Cassian's voice cracked as he called out. The woman spun around immediately, her eyes searching for the source of the cry. The moment she saw him, her expression shifted from shock to overwhelming relief. "Cassian!" she gasped, running toward him. He barely had time to react before she pulled him into a tight embrace, wrapping him in warmth and safety, something he hadn't felt in days. His father and brother reached him moments later, their arms trembling as they joined the embrace. We thought we'd never see you again." His mother choked out between sobs, cupping his face in her hands. "Are you all right? Did someone hurt you?" "No, I'm fine," he reassured her, though his voice was still shaky. "Nix saved me." For a moment, his family looked at him in confusion, until the sound of a soft neigh drew their attention. They turned toward the edge of the clearing where Nix had been standing silently, watching the reunion unfold. Slowly, the horse stepped forward, his presence both commanding and calm. Cassian's family stared in awe as he approached, and with a mixture of pride and gratitude, Cassian reached out, resting a hand on his companion's strong neck. "He's the one who pulled me from the river," the boy explained, his fingers running gently through Nix's mane. "He helped me cross a ravine, escape from the wolves. I wouldn't be here without him." Cassian's father, a strong man with hands hardened by years of labor, cautiously stepped toward the horse. He extended a hand, and Nix, as if understanding the gesture, lowered his head slightly to let the man touch him. "He's an incredible animal," his father said in a deep voice, his gaze filled with pride as he looked at Cassian. "He brought our son back to us." Cassian's mother, wiping away her tears, approached as well. She placed a gentle hand on Nix's back. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing full well that the horse couldn't understand her words. "Thank you for keeping him safe." Nix neighed softly, as if accepting the gratitude. Cassian, his hand still resting on his loyal friend's neck, broke into a wide smile. For the first time in days, he felt like everything would be okay. That night, as the family gathered around the crackling fire, Cassian recounted every moment of his journey. He spoke of how he had fallen into the river, how Nix had saved him, and the countless obstacles they had overcome together. His words carried a depth of emotion, and each time he mentioned Nix, his eyes shimmered with gratitude. "He's more than just a horse," he finally said, looking at his family. "He's my friend, and I can't imagine leaving him behind." His family nodded, fully grasping the weight of what he had been through. His mother leaned in, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then he stays with us," she said with a warm smile. "This is his home now, just as much as it is ours." Word of Cassian and Nix's journey spread quickly beyond the family. The very next day, as the boy helped his mother collect firewood, a neighbor passed by their home and caught sight of the magnificent horse resting nearby. "Where did that horse come from?" the man asked, eyeing Nix with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Cassian couldn't hold back. With enthusiasm, he relived the events of the past few days, the river, the wolves, the ravine, and how Nix had been his protector, his unwavering companion. To the neighbor, the story was almost too incredible to believe, like something out of a legend. "People in town need to hear this," the man said before heading off. And so, in just a matter of days, the tale had reached every corner of the village. The story spread like wildfire, passed from person to person, with each retelling adding new details that made it sound even more heroic. Cassian became the brave boy who had survived the impossible, and Nix, the loyal horse, turned into a symbol of courage and friendship. One afternoon, the mayor arrived at Cassian's house, accompanied by several townspeople. In his hands was a formal invitation. They wanted to hold a ceremony to honor Nix and thank him for saving the boy. "He's a hero, Cassian," the mayor said with a warm smile, "and heroes deserve to be recognized." Cassian accepted, though he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. He had never been the center of attention before, but he knew that Nyx deserved every bit of appreciation. On the day of the ceremony, the entire town gathered in the main square. Colorful banners were strung across the streets, and a large sign hung overhead that read, "Thank you, Nyx, for your bravery." Dressed in his best clothes, Cassian stood beside his four-legged friend, his heart swelling with both pride and emotion. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath and faced the crowd. "I don't know if I would have made it back without Nyx," he said, his voice slightly unsteady at first. "He saved me when I needed him the most, but more than that, he taught me what it means to be brave, what it means to never give up." Nyx, as if he knew they were talking about him, let out a soft neigh, drawing smiles from everyone in the crowd. After the speech, many people approached Cassian and Nyx, their eyes filled with admiration and awe. They reached out to touch the horse with reverence, some even with tears streaming down their faces, as if they were in the presence of something far greater than just an animal. "You're a lucky boy," an elderly woman told Cassian, her voice filled with warmth. "Not everyone finds a friend like him." Cassian nodded, his gaze resting on Nyx with gratitude. "I know," he replied softly. "He's one of a kind." The days that followed were peaceful, a welcome change after all the tension and hardship. Cassian's family worked tirelessly to build a stable for Nyx, a comfortable place where he could rest and truly feel at home. The stable wasn't large, but every nail, every plank of wood was placed with love. Cassian helped paint the walls in bright, cheerful colors, while his younger brother carefully laid down fresh straw inside, ensuring a soft bed for their beloved companion. When the stable was finally finished, Cassian led Nyx inside, showing him his new home. "Well, what do you think?" he asked, running his hand gently along the horse's neck. Nyx let out a soft neigh, as if giving his approval. Each morning, Cassian spent time with his friend, brushing his coat, speaking to him about whatever thoughts filled his mind, and sometimes just sitting beside him, enjoying the quiet companionship. There was something about Nyx's presence that made him feel stronger, more secure. In town, people still spoke of their story. At school, children whispered about them as if they were characters in a legend, and the adults used their journey as an example to teach lessons about loyalty and courage. "If a horse can do that for a child, imagine what we could do for each other," Mr. Dorian, the town's baker, often said. Over time, Cassian realized that something within him had changed. He was no longer the same boy who had once fallen into the river, frightened and lost. Now, he felt stronger, more determined. Every challenge he faced reminded him of the lessons he had learned throughout his journey. Fear was not something meant to stop him. It was something he could overcome. One afternoon, while watching over Nyx in the open field, Cassian gazed at the horizon. The sky was painted with warm hues, and a gentle breeze brushed against his face. "Do you think there are more adventures out there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nyx met his gaze with deep, knowing eyes, tilting his head slightly. Cassian smiled, as if he had received an answer. "I guess there's only one way to find out," he said, patting Nyx's back. At that moment, something ignited within him, a spark of curiosity, a yearning to explore the unknown. He knew that no matter what lay ahead, as long as Nyx was by his side, there was no challenge they couldn't face. As the last golden rays of sunlight bathed their faces, Cassian and Nyx stood together, staring into the vast horizon, ready for whatever the future had in store. Together, they were more than just a boy and a horse. They were a team, a promise that true bravery and friendship could overcome any obstacle. Cassian and Nyx's story is one of deep emotions and invaluable life lessons. Through their journey, we witness an ordinary boy confronting extraordinary trials, from battling the relentless forces of nature to standing fearlessly in defense of his closest friend. But what leaves the greatest impression is how someone so young could possess such unwavering resilience and inner strength, an inspiration to all who hear his tale. After the speech, many people approached Cassian and Nyx, their eyes filled with admiration and awe. They reached out to touch the horse with reverence, some even with tears streaming down their faces, as if they were in the presence of something far greater than just an animal. "You're a lucky boy," an elderly woman told Cassian, her voice filled with warmth. "Not everyone finds a friend like him." Cassian nodded, his gaze resting on Nyx with gratitude. "I know," he replied softly. "He's one of a kind." The days that followed were peaceful, a welcome change after all the tension and hardship. Cassian's family worked tirelessly to build a stable for Nyx, a comfortable place where he could rest and truly feel at home. The stable wasn't large, but every nail, every plank of wood was placed with love. Cassian helped paint the walls in bright, cheerful colors, while his younger brother carefully laid down fresh straw inside, ensuring a soft bed for their beloved companion. When the stable was finally finished, Cassian led Nyx inside, showing him his new home. "Well, what do you think?" he asked, running his hand gently along the horse's neck. Nyx let out a soft neigh, as if giving his approval. Each morning, Cassian spent time with his friend, brushing his coat, speaking to him about whatever thoughts filled his mind, and sometimes just sitting beside him, enjoying the quiet companionship. There was something about Nyx's presence that made him feel stronger, more secure. In town, people still spoke of their story. At school, children whispered about them as if they were characters in a legend, and the adults used their journey as an example to teach lessons about loyalty and courage. If a horse can do that for a child, imagine what we could do for each other, Mr. Dorian, the town's baker, often said. Over time, Cassian realized that something within him had changed. He was no longer the same boy who had once fallen into the river, frightened and lost. Now, he felt stronger, more determined. Every challenge he faced reminded him of the lessons he had learned throughout his journey. Fear was not something meant to stop him, it was something he could overcome. One afternoon, while watching over Nyx in the open field, Cassian gazed at the horizon. The sky was painted with warm hues, and a gentle breeze brushed against his face. "Do you think there are more adventures out there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nyx met his gaze with deep, knowing eyes, tilting his head slightly. Cassian smiled, as if he had received an answer. "I guess there's only one way to find out," he said, patting Nyx's back. At that moment, something ignited within him, a spark of curiosity, a yearning to explore the unknown. He knew that no matter what lay ahead, as long as Nyx was by his side, there was no challenge they couldn't face. As the last golden rays of sunlight bathed their faces, Cassian and Nyx stood together, staring into the vast horizon, ready for whatever the future had in store. Together, they were more than just a boy and a horse. They were a team, a promise that true bravery and friendship could overcome any obstacle. Wow, what a journey, right? Cassian's story was intense, full of fear, courage, and of course, that incredible bond between a boy and his horse. But here's the thing, this story isn't real. Cassian and Nyx don't exist. However, situations like this, they do happen. Kids wander too far, accidents happen, And not every child is lucky enough to have a Nyx to save them. Some children get lost and never find their way home. Some drown because no one is there in time. Others face dangers they're too young to handle alone. It's heartbreaking, but it's the reality. That's why this story is more than just an adventure. It's a reminder. A reminder to parents to always keep an eye on their kids, no matter how safe things seem. One moment of distraction can change everything. And to kids, it's a lesson that nature isn't a playground without risks. Being brave is great, but being careful, that's even better. So, what do you think? What part of the story hit you the hardest? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if this made you reflect, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes a story, even a fictional one, can make all the difference. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.